but then I will say good morning. My name is Ella, and I'm a local here at the IMC. And I will just briefly introduce Ingela Visuri, this morning's speaker. I've known Ingela as a colleague and friend for many years now. She did her PhD in the study of religion, where she did ethnographic research with autistic young adults, where she interviews and research with them to understand their personal religious orientation and the beliefs and practices that they adopt. And now she's a senior lecturer at the Dalarna University in Sweden, where she teaches study of religion. But she holds a postdoc from the Swedish Research Council, an international postdoc that connects her to the IMC. So she is here at the IMC for the next couple of years to do a really interesting project on with autistic people in live-action roleplay. So we're really happy to have you here, and I look forward to hearing the presentation.
Thank you, Ella. And good morning, and thanks everyone for joining this presentation today. So just a brief sketch about what I'm planning to talk about today. I would like to introduce the background and some methodological reflection related to autism. I'll try to keep that brief because there's a lot to be said about methodology when it comes to autism research. But I'll try to sort of hold back a little bit. And then I wanted to present my ongoing project, the methodology, and the starting points I have there. And so this project is going on for 3 years, and I'm 1 year into my project. So I also want to introduce some preliminary results that I have from the first observations I've been doing, and also some interviews I've had with adult experienced larpers on the autism spectrum, and then wrap up with some conclusions. And I'm thinking the talk will be approximately 40 minutes. And I should also say that when I say LARP, that means live action role play. So I'm not confusing you. Last time I was here in Aarhus, I was talking to Ella, Savannah, and Ben. And we were talking about paradoxes. I'm very fascinated by scientific paradoxes. And Ben Mardell provided me with this beautiful quote from the Danish scientist Niels Bohr. How wonderful that we have met with a paradox. Now we have some hope of making progress. The first paradox that got me interested in autism research was the mind blindness hypothesis of religion. Scholars from America primarily argued that since mentalizing with other people, that is interpreting what other people have in mind and what intentions they have, since that's so crucial for also understanding what invisible agents might have in mind, such as ghosts, spirits, gods, or jinn that are found all over the world. Since that's so central, that would make autistic individuals unable to understand supernatural relations. But I worked for 6 years at the special educational department where I was teaching non-confessional religion education. And I knew from my former pupils that many of them had such beliefs. So I flipped that coin, and what I looked into was, so if you struggle with mentalizing, which is sort of at the core of the autism diagnosis, how come that these individuals still form intimate relationships with supernatural beings that they find to be very real? The paradox I'm looking at right now departs from a hypothesis in cognitive autism research, where scholars have argued for the past 25 years that imagination and creativity would be inhibited in individuals on the autism spectrum. And that means that they would find it hard to think of novel concepts that they have never encountered before. And then again, I have this teaching experience, and I know hundreds and hundreds of autistic individuals, and many of them are extremely creative. And many of them are also drawn to these imagination-based hobbies, which I will return to. So the core question in this postdoc project is, so how come, if they would have imagination deficits, how come autistic individuals are attracted to imagination-based hobbies? I'm also challenging one of my own hypotheses, because one of the conclusions in my PhD thesis was that gods, angels, and spirits are very convenient from an autistic cognitive perspective because they have no bodies. There are no complicated facial expressions, there's no intonation, there's no irony, there's no sarcasm. So it's actually quite good to have a disembodied communication from an autistic perspective. At least that's what my participants conveyed. But considering the highly embodied hobby that LARPing is, so why do they engage in a super embodied practice such as LARPing and really seem to enjoy that? So that's also interesting, I think. Just a quick Googling on the internet. Here I Googled autism and LARP. And as you see, there are some anecdotal reports about live action role play being sort of a good thing for autists. But there is very little research so far. And it also seems as if autistic individuals are overrepresented in LARPing communities. And with overrepresented, I mean that it would be more than the 2% of the general population that are involved. And one of the LARPing instructors where I'm doing field work, he once said that you can't even throw a pebble at a LARP without hitting an autistic person. But LARPing is also very cognitively demanding. And if you look at the diagnostic manual, it also involves many of the difficulties described in relation to autism, such as planning, perspective taking, interaction, and creativity. So I think LARPing as a concept sort of challenges previous research, which I'm interested in. So I mentioned that researchers for long have suggested that autistic individuals have poor imagination. And I will explain how they came to this conclusion. Here's an example of a commonly used test called the Torrance test. So what we see here is that the participants in these experiments, they get some starting shapes. So the researchers instruct them to be creative. So use this circle, go creative, make something fun and new from it. You can also combine that with that one, and then you should complete this one. And there are similar tests with pieces of foam, for instance. But then there's also a secret key. So the researchers have decided what solution would be more creative and what solution would be less creative. And in all these experiments, we see that autistic individuals do not perform as well as non-autistic individuals. And I will explain why. I'm arguing that what this test measures in autistic individuals is not creativity and imagination, but it's how well you can decode what the researcher wants of you. Because giving someone an assignment, it means that you have to sort of figure out how to do the assignment, which requires mentalizing skills. You have to understand what the researcher wants you to do. And again, my experience from being a teacher is that autistic people often want to do things right, but the key is also secret here. So they get stuck. And I was talking to some of my former pupils about this on Facebook, actually. And one of them, she responded that when she was in school, her arts teacher would ask her to draw portraits. And she would get stuck. She didn't know how to, what to do and how to do it. And it could take days for her before starting to draw. But at home in the evenings, she would be drawing portraits all the time because they were on her own terms. And that is what I call intrapersonal imagination. So I think in imagination research, we need to separate between like, what are we actually talking about? These are photos that I took when I was doing field work during Halloween in a school, a special educational school for autistic pupils. And this came as no surprise to me that they had spent weeks or even months creating their costumes. And I would also observe in the corridors or in the lounge area how these pupils would sit and talk about computer games or fantasy literature, and they'd be like so into it and even like argue about these universes that they were like really well acquainted with. And what I think is important when you're doing autism research is to get beyond the surface. My friend has an autistic son, and he's very much into maps. He loves maps. And he has an app on his iPad where he's sort of, he's learning all the maps of the world, and he knows all the capitals and all the rivers and all the mountains and stuff. So if you just observe that, that would seem typically autistic, right? It's very like systematizing, it's very structured, it's fact-based. But since I was in the middle of my PhD project and my participants started talking a lot about like imaginary worlds that they had when they were daydreaming, which also had a lot of parasocial or fiction-based characters in them, I asked him if he ever fantasized about maps. And then he told me, he was 14 years then, I think, he told me that he has actually created his own world where he has redrawn all the maps, and he's sort of adapting the people living in different countries to the topography and what they eat and what religion they have and who's fighting with who. So beneath this app that seems like super autistic, there was this whole imaginary world that he was really absorbed in. But you really have to sort of ask the right questions and be interested in what is going beyond that, which we see at the surface. A closely related research field is about autism and pretend play. And again, researchers are arguing that autistic kids are less likely to engage in and sustain play, and they are also poor at pretend play. Again, this is interesting from a LARPing perspective, because this is what LARPing is about, right? And there's one a study which I think is really nice, made by Elizabeth Fain in 2015, where she's following young autistic, not adults, but maybe teenagers at a role-playing camp. And she argues that, when the context is right, autistic individuals are happy to engage in play. So she highlights, for instance, that the social structure of the practices of LARPing, that you have character sheets and you sort of get to build the world and you get all the facts and details, so you know the social context. You also have the narrative and the mythology, where she found that the emotional turbulence, you can actually think of Harry Potter, for instance. There's a lot of turbulence, a lot of like dark things going on, but that is reinterpreted as sort of strength and power and special skills. And that also sustains this like mode of play. And she also highlights the nature of the social community, that it's inclusive, and how that makes a difference. And I also know that Ella has really interesting research on autism and play, which people should have a look at. Before moving on, I just want to share a quote from my previous participant, Edgar. So as I mentioned, my participants were talking a lot about parasocial characters. I thought we would be talking about supernatural relations, which we did, but they also wanted to talk about parasocial relations. So Edgar told me about his childhood. When I felt lonely or wanted to go deep into my creativity, then I could talk to myself and lived in a totally different world, just like that. I could, for instance, create a whole spaceship. I could remove all tables, all chairs, and create something totally different. And it was kind of fun. But then when I talked and communicated, I'd be like, I mean, it will sound a bit filmic and Hollywood, but I'd say Alpha Team B, blah, blah, blah. And then you'd hear, yes, I'm here, blah, we are moving forward. And yes, whatever it might be. It was as if as if I had lots of people in the room, but still all of them were me. I could duplicate myself and totally change my looks and my personality. So he was role playing, but he was doing it in his imagination. And then he adds, I made it up all by myself. That was how I played. And the thing is that I wasn't able to speak. So he was nonverbal, but he had this verbal inner world where he was talking to these parasocial relations. Okay, so moving on to my current project. I'm currently doing field work at the LARPing workshop in Sweden, and they are doing educational role plays for pupils all over Sweden. When it's not a pandemic, they usually have like 200 days a year when they are out role-playing with pupils. And they are also role-playing with pupils at special educational schools where all of them are autistic. So my research question is, what kind of social learning is going on during these educational LARPs? Would LARPs be a sort of beneficial way of learning theoretical and abstract concepts? So for instance, power relations that are not so visible, but when you sort of gain an understanding of such constructs, you start seeing them. And I'm also interested in the role of fantasy proneness. So fantasy proneness means that the boundary between everyday life and imagination is a bit thinner. So people who are fantasy prone would daydream a lot. So why is imagination interesting in relation to learning? Well, we know from the cognitive science that the brain is really poor at discriminating between fantasy and so-called reality, which means that we experience things we fantasize about as very realistic. If I would, for instance, be late for a flight and I'd sit on the airport and I start fantasizing about what would happen if I miss the flight, my heart would start beating faster, I would start sweating, and I would get a stress reaction. But I haven't missed the flight yet. It's just a fantasy about what would happen, but the body reacts as if it had already happened. And I will be working with a theory called social simulation. So if we experience things, we can also simulate them again in new contexts. And that is also a way of preparing for agency in real life through experience-based learning. And Kaufman and Libby call this experience taking. So you would experience things as if they were real, as if these experiences were your own. And I'm doing what I call a mixed methods anthropology. Here are some photos from EduLARPs, educational LARPs that I've taken part in. So I've actually changed my method a little bit because my first plan was to be there and then I would conduct interviews with autistic pupils. But during my pilot study, I discovered that it was really hard for them to talk about learning. It was hard for them to reflect because maybe they've tried LARP once or twice. And it's also hard when you're 14 years old, 15 years old to sort of have that perspective. So I paused that project a little bit with these interviews, and now I'm interviewing adult experienced LARPers on the autism spectrum. And I made this post in a Facebook group and I got 17 participants in one day, which I think also is a bit telling. And I'm also using some quantitative tools. I have a questionnaire on the LARP experience, and I'm using the Creative Experiences questionnaire, which is about fantasy proneness. And I'm also trying out the character attachment scale, which is really made for video games. It's not perfect, but I'm trying it out, and I'll just see where that ends up. And it's also good with the quantitative tools because I get to compare autistic and non-autistic individuals when it comes to fantasy proneness. I should also say something about Nordic LARP. I think people like me who've never tried LARPing before, we have this idea that people are out fighting in the woods with swords and that's it. And I mean, people also do fight in woods with swords, but I'm impressed with how complex LARPing is. And there's this Nordic tradition, which is not about competition, but about collaboration. So on nordiclarp.org, it's defined as a term for shared LARP traditions in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. What sets the Nordic LARP traditions apart from others is a strong emphasis on collaboration and collective creation, unobtrusive rules, as well as a rich variety of play styles and settings, sometimes including heavy themes. So Nordic LARP has become sort of a concept that is also used in other countries. In my understanding, Nordic LARP provides a brave space where people deal with quite complicated and sometimes dark topics. It's also a safe space where you have expectation management, you have consent, where you decide on beforehand that if, for instance, if I was playing with Savannah and I would be the oppressor, we would sort of make a consent before that, can I do this to you? But then you can also stop in the middle and say, no, I'm not comfortable doing this. Can we sort of renegotiate this? So it's both safe and brave. And many of those I've been talking to also say that they're attracted by this dimension where you get to sort of understand other people better, and you can also use LARPing as a tool for personal development. So EduLARP, that's basically LARPing used in an educational setting. And here's a picture from Østerskov Efterskole here in Denmark, where the whole pedagogy is based on role-playing and role-taking. And it's also based on narrative didactics. And I also want to mention that we just got new funding, the LARPing workshop and me. So we got 2.5 million Swedish kronor now for a project where we will be designing LARPs together with autistic pupils. So they will be active from scratch while sort of designing the world, designing the characters, and so on. And so we will be doing that for 2 years. And it also allows me to follow the same pupils for a longer period of time, which is helpful because I can then observe the learning that's going on. And I'm also there to advise a bit on how to adapt LARPs better to autistic needs based on the people I am talking to. So I'm not really the expert. It's like the expert LARPers that provide me with input. So I'll share some of my preliminary results with you. I'll start with a couple of observations and also some quotes from these adult LARPers that I interviewed. The first EduLARP that I took part in is the School of Magic, which is sort of a Swedish Harry Potter school. And the pupils were in year 7, 8, and 9, so between 14 and 16 years old. So the first part of the LARP was 1 week, and then the second part was the next week. And I will describe 2 very different pupils to you. So the first person I noticed was Sam. He was so excited when we were about to start. He could barely sit still. And it turned out that he had prepared his own manuscript for this LARP because he knew it would be about a magic school. And he even had brought his own little wand because he loved Harry Potter. And he ended up sort of making his own LARP on the side. So the LARPing instructors, they would have a class where you would mix different liquids and so on and make magic potions. But he asked me to join him in another room where a teacher was lying flat face down on the floor. So he had killed one of the teachers with a magic spell. And I was playing the principal of this school, and it was a little bit dramatic. And afterwards, he didn't want to leave. He just kept on talking about how exciting it had been. And also the LARPing instructors, they told him when he said, okay, next week, I will kill everyone. And they said, well, you can't kill everyone because LARPing has to be fun and it's not super fun to be dead. So, and they had to sort of repeat that to him for a few times. Then there was also this shy girl that I call Annie. And that was her first EduLARP experience. And she came in and she looked very, very tense. And I was a bit curious to see how she would go on. But she decided to take part both days. So she came the week after as well and looked a little bit more relaxed. But it's also very allowing because the pupils, they can be super active, but they can also be a little bit on the side. They don't have to participate actively if they don't want to. But it's on their own initiative. They don't have to go if they don't want to. I was also a little bit surprised because in the debriefing session, I asked the pupils about a worry I had because I thought that they got very little information on beforehand. And I know that autistic individuals often like to have a lot of predictability, and they got very little information. So I asked them, would you have liked more information on beforehand? And 5 of them just screamed, no, you can't give us any information. We don't want to know what's going to happen because that would ruin the fun. And that was interesting to me. I wasn't prepared for that. And I'll come back to that in a bit. Then I took part a few weeks ago in another LARP with at the same school. So many of the same pupils were there, but also some new pupils. And this LARP is called Alpha and Omega. And it's about a planet where people are born without gender. But when you're a teenager, they have a ritual where they divide people into alphas that are leaders, strong people, and omegas who are sort of emotional and a bit vulnerable and caring and empathic. So it's really about like dictatorship, but also about gender roles and power structures. So again, Sam was there and he was much more collaborative now. He didn't kill anyone. And also the LARPing instructors, they reminded all the pupils that this has to be fun for everyone. But he decided very early on to riot against this system. So it ends on the second day with him seizing a gun from one of the guards. And then he sort of kidnapped the test leaders in this ritual, and he like locked himself up in a room with them, and he told them off that it's not okay to divide people into alphas and omegas and so on. It was also interesting to watch Annie because she was so much more relaxed, and also that she chose to participate in a second EduLARP. She was also taking part more actively, sometimes standing by the side. But she looked much more relaxed. They were very happy, and especially the new pupils who had never tried EduLARP before, they thought it was super fun. But on day 2, they were so exhausted, especially Sam. Sam had, he wanted me to interview him, and I told him that maybe we can do the interview another day because you're so tired. He said, no, I want to participate. But then in the end, he said, okay, no, I'm too tired, I can't do it. So this also made us talk a little bit about maybe we need to have more pauses. Maybe it's too exhausting. There's so much like emotional turmoil going on and so on. So I'll show you some examples. I think Annie is very interesting, her sort of development over these two LARPs. I decided, it was actually because I noticed that Annie wouldn't speak a lot. So I decided not to make verbal debriefing, but we made silent debriefing through post-its. So everyone could sort of provide input on their experience without having to share it with everyone. So the first day I asked them 3 questions, like what feelings did you have during the LARP? What was the most difficult and what was the most fun? So Annie wrote the feeling was that it was totally okay. What was most difficult? Well, the hardest part was to talk a little more. I'm rather shy. And the most fun was that you got to try something you've almost never done. And the second time I also asked them, what did you learn? And Annie wrote, I have learned to be a little bit more social. And I think that's telling somehow that this is a brave and safe space. The meaning of the word fun is also interesting. So Mark Anderson and colleagues have written an article now on what fun actually means. And departing from predictive coding, which is, or predictive processing, which is a model for understanding like the primary functions of the brain, that we need to predict what's going on all the time. They describe fun as a sweet spot between too much and too little surprise. And that was a general reaction from the pupils. It was fun. And I think that also reveals that they got the right amount of challenge and excitement. If you get too much excitement, it will be scary. If you get too little excitement, it will be boring. It was also interesting to note that also in the interviews that I will present in the next slide, surprises and this multisensory input like body language and light and sounds and so on doesn't seem to pose such a big problem when it comes to pretense, because you have nothing to lose. And I think this is beautifully illustrated by my adult participant, Melon. In reality, misunderstandings collide with the world. In LARPing, these add value. As simple as that. I mean, society doesn't offer any help. You seek psychologist after psychologist after psychologist. LARPing has given me more than all these psychologists together. It's live cognitive behavioral therapy. You're faced with these impossible situations. You're forced to communicate with people in one way or another. In reality, you wouldn't often do that because you're scared of what the reaction might be. In LARPs, you want to see the confusion. You want to see where it goes. From an autistic perspective, it's a sheltered workshop, which makes you push the boundaries for your own convenience when you come out in reality. And that's exactly the type of social learning that I'm interested in. Elizabeth Fain, I think that sort of, it mirrors what she's saying about autism and LARPing as well. I believe that it heals and that it does so in a way that is less consistent with biomedical understandings of healing and more consistent with the kinds of symbolic and social healing found in so-called folk practices, including scholarly work that considers psychotherapy in that light. Participation in the camp could be understood to treat the illness, meaning the life problems arising from autism spectrum conditions, particularly social estrangement, rather than the disease, meaning the neurobiological substrate that underlies autistic difference. My participant Nix, she also describes how important it is that you're not representing yourself in a LARP because you are your character. Somehow, if you're dressed up as someone else and you're acting as someone else, it becomes rather prestigeless because then you don't have to impress anyone else, really. Another great advantage with LARPs is that since there's really no prepared manuscript, as opposed to if it had been a theatrical production, there's nothing that really could count as wrong. Well, that would be talking in your mobile phone or so. But as long as you stay within that realm and within reasonableness, well, then it's rather prestigeless. And I think that it also highlights the fact that there's no right and wrong as it is in everyday life, where you get quite heavily punished for being socially different. It's not connected to me as a person. That's important, she says. I also have a participant who's doing vampire LARPs. So as I said before, I've never done LARPing, and this was so fascinating to me because when he described vampire LARPs, it's a lot about power struggles and deceit, and you have to be good at lying. And autistic individuals often find it really hard to sort of lie convincingly. So I asked him about what attracted him to this genre of LARPs. And he said that he relates very closely to the vampire narrative. I'm a night person and I'm very sensitive to light and so on. But that wasn't the main reason. The main reason was, well, the mood. During this time when I was in my teens, I wasn't diagnosed or anything at the time, but I was attracted by the emotions, the mood, the experience. And that also mirrors Fain's point about the myth being reinterpreted, like suffering and darkness being reinterpreted in terms of power. So I asked him about his first LARPing experience, and he said, I was very nervous the first time, very insecure. It was stressful. A lot of people I had never met who were also playing characters I hadn't met and knew nothing about. But then when we started our own group, then you'd have a relation to the creation of what to call it. Then you'd be in control of it all. And he differs a little bit from the others I've interviewed who said that they got immediately like overwhelmed with joy the first time they were LARPing. But he describes that like he had a period of insecurity, but he was so attracted to this myth that he continued doing it. But then when he got involved in sort of writing the story and creating the narratives and the character, that's when he started feeling comfortable around it. I also asked him about like the lies and the deception, that it sort of doesn't make sense if you consider autistic sort of typical traits. And he said, well, I totally understand what you mean, he said. Personally, I don't do a lot of betraying and cheating since I'm really bad at lying, but I'm trying to follow an intrigue, which is also very hard since I don't always understand what it's about. But I'm attracted to this environment because I love the world and there's a lot of nice people and so on. I'm probably not the perfect vampire LARPer since I'm quite asocial that way, but I think it's a very attractive environment. I tend to play physical characters since it's easier for me to play than social characters that I'm not good at playing. So it's mental or physical characters. And that also shows the freedom in LARP that you get to design your own character according to yourself. So I've been thinking about a lot, like, in what environments do autistic individuals seem to thrive? And I'm sort of playing around a little bit with these terms like meritocracy and sociocracy. I think that if you look at social areas where your merits would be highly valued, such as in academia or in music, in theater, and also in LARPing, that would be an area where people don't care so much about your social skills, but the perception is focused at competencies. So these provide more permissive spaces where also autistic individuals can sort of, be their best. But so when I'm interviewing people, they often return to this case of mingling at a party with strangers and how horrible it is. And that's a space where your social competencies are in focus. And they also describe how you know, you make one mistake and people immediately think, oh, that's an odd person. And then you have to live with that label and you get so apprehensive about like making such mistakes. But in these meritocratic environments, you don't have to care so much about that, but it's also actually more interesting what you're good at doing or performing. So I argue that LARP is an optimal autistic niche. It's an environment that suits autistic people. So cultural affordances is a concept coined by James Gibson in 1966, which describes how resources of the environment suits the observer's needs and capabilities, and also describes how the observer affects the environment. And you can see in these LARPing communities, what people have told me was that before the Me Too movement, that discussion was already going on in LARPing communities about like how do we make this a space that fits more people and where they feel safe. And Fain writes, the structured social practices of role-playing, from the character design sheet to the genre-specific formality of interactions, constituted a sociocultural ecology affordances of which provided the support and organization participants needed for successful social coordination. And I also argue that when you remove the social obstacles, you also remove the disability of being autistic. Autism as a disability only exists if you're in an environment where there are specific social demands. Well, my first project made me think a lot about how I am as an individual when it comes to sensory perception. This project has made me think a lot about cultural and social norms. I found this rather odd article yesterday, which is titled "Teaching Children with Autism to Tell Socially Appropriate Lies." So the authors argue that it's also socially appropriate to be deceptive when a friend solicits an opinion on his or her unattractive new haircut, or when a spouse asks how he or she appears in ill-fitting clothing. And especially Mellon, he talked about that a lot. He's like, what you guys call real life, that's a LARP. You're just pretending. You're just going in and out of different environments and you're like LARPing that now I'm this character and now I'm this character, but no one ever tells us the rules and you just naturally seem to know what's going on and I don't. And I'm thinking, you know, so fashion, for instance, like those of us who are not autistic, we're so good at pretending and masking. But how often do we ask ourselves, like, why are we doing this? Why are we just accepting that, you know, fashion just changes and we have to like change our whole wardrobe, which is super messy and expensive? And I think that non-autistic individuals have something to learn here. The Swedish journalist Clara Törnvall, who is autistic and has recently published a book, she writes, I've spent my whole life masking, playing the neurotypical game and figuring out social codes. I'm so sick of it. I wish the autistic attitude would be the norm. I wish that all this theater wasn't normalized. So in conclusion, I think it's interesting that prediction becomes less important when there is nothing to lose in a social sense. The fun of LARPing, it indicates that there is just the right amount of surprise and excitement. And you also have a sense of control and more freedom compared to real life. And that LARPing is an optimal space for autistic sociality. And my final quote is from a participant in my previous project who was talking about parasocial characters. Not fitting into society, we will create our own worlds where we design things to be the way we want them to be. Thank you.